Michelle.
Yeah. All done.
Yeah, welcome everyone to our last meeting of this council term, and we've got quite a full agenda. So, I said welcome to everybody, and in particular to Robert Smith, our cabinet member, and Helen, Director of Education, and I can see Pam and Kate as well. So welcome to you both. Good. Are there any apologies, Michelle?
Yes, councillors Bev Hopkins and Miles Langstone, and also the co-optee Alexander Roberts.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Next, we get the prohibition of party whips and declaration of party whips. Okay, no comments. Minutes of the last meeting. I had a chance to look through them for accuracy. If so, could I have somebody to propose they're a true record? That's Linda. And a seconder. Anyone second the minutes?
I will second them, Linda.
Yeah, okay, thanks. That's great. Thank you. And public questions?
No public questions today.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're moving on at pace to item 6. And the next item is a verbal update on asylum seeker and refugee pupils. I'm very pleased to welcome Pam Cole, who is the senior lead for ethnic minority learners and equalities. And Robert, do you want to come in first, or Helen or Kate? How do you want to play that?
Yes, just to introduce the item and ask Pam to take us through the report check, because obviously this is a very contemporary issue and something that I know is close to our hearts, and it is important that Swansea gets this right. So I think I'll hand over to Pam, and then if there are any questions afterwards, I'm happy to respond in the office likewise.
Great, thanks, Robert. Pam. Pam.
Okay, thank you
there you
for
are.
the invite this afternoon. As you just, can you hear me?
You were disappearing
thank you for the invite this afternoon. So as you said, I'm the senior lead for minority ethnic learners and equalities within the. Oh, I'm on headphones. Maybe I'll be better without them on.
Could be. You're disappearing every few words, actually.
Is that better?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Apologies, I moved into the office. Normally I'm at home because I've got another appointment. Am I clear enough now? Okay, so I'm the lead officer, as you said, for minority ethnic learners. So asylum seekers and refugees sit under my remit, and my team is the English as an additional language and Gypsy Roma traveller team. So we usually abbreviate that to EAL and GRT. So within that team is just myself as a lead officer, and I've got 2 part-time specialist advisors who make up a full-time post. It's a very, very small team. We're funded through the Welsh Government's Minority Ethnic and Gypsy Roma Traveller Grant, which is abbreviated to the MEGRIT grant. So the majority of the local authorities' funding for that grant is devolved out to schools. I'll devolve that out based on the numbers of English as an additional language and Gypsy traveller learners. So when we're considering asylum seekers and refugees and the broader group of minority ethnic learners, the actual key responsibility for support lies within schools. So we don't provide any direct support centrally for children and young people from those groups. So our role is very much about advising and guiding schools, and we will give advice and guidance on individual learners if schools come to us for that type of support, but we're not actually involved in directly supporting pupils. So our team essentially operates on an advisory and school improvement type model. So our core responsibility in that sense is supporting and building the capacity of all of our schools to provide that high quality, inclusive provision that values the diversity in our city and raises standards for all our minority ethnic learners. And that, of course, includes asylum seekers and refugees. So broadly, this involves monitoring funding spend, working with schools to self-evaluate an action plan, and I'll come back to that later, providing advice and guidance, developing and signposting to resources, whether that be curriculum or more generic ones, delivering and facilitating a range of CPD, identifying and sharing of effective practice between schools, working on specific projects, and then so in general what underpins that is supporting the wider inclusion, diversity and anti-racist agendas, which are really, really important. So working in this way actually only came into place in January 2019. Prior to that, we had a much bigger team and there was pupil support involved. So in essence, this model of support is relatively new, particularly taken into consideration that we've had a pandemic for the last couple of years. So before we move on, it's probably pertinent to consider who we're talking about when we refer to asylum seekers and refugees. So asylum seekers are people who are seeking international protection from conflict and persecution. And they are seeking protection as a refugee, but their claim for refugee status has not yet been assessed. Whereas the term for refugee is slightly more complex, and it's often used as a blanket term for people displaced by war, violence or persecution. So we're currently hearing that term in the media in terms of with the Ukraine war, but there are more specific meanings under international law, and there is a specific definition. In essence, asylum seekers who have positive decisions on their cases then become a refugee in a legal sense. So the asylum seekers that we have in Swansea will have housing provided for them, but the families that arrive here will not have made a choice to come to Swansea. Once they get refugee status, then a number of the families will remain and others will move on elsewhere, and they live on pretty minimal finances. So I think it's around £5.64 a day per person for food, clothing and so on. And our asylum seeker children in the main are entitled to free school meals and uniform grants in a similar manner to other children who are on benefits. So we need to consider that really in terms of my work, asylum seekers and refugee children and young people are part of that wider group of minority ethnic learners. So those learners that are not white British in terms of their ethnic background. And many of those learners and many of the asylum seekers and refugees will have what we call English as an additional language. So that is where their first language is neither English or Welsh. So much of the work of myself and my team is focused around good practice and building practice in that field of English as an additional language, so EAL. And as I said, asylum seekers and refugees will be incorporated into that wider scope of work. So if we think about those learners in terms of numbers, from the pupil level annual school census, so the PLASC last year in 2021, 16.1% of children and young people in our Swansea schools were from a minority ethnic background. 12.7% of those were identified as having EAL. But numbers of asylum seekers and refugees are not actually required as part of that PLASC return. So there's not actually a formal mechanism for collecting those numbers. However, we do get housing lists from the asylum seeker housing provider into education. That's mainly for the purposes of cross-checking that no children are missing education, so for safeguarding purposes, but it does allow us to in a sense monitor numbers. So in January we had 170 asylum seekers in our schools, which is about 0.5% of the total school population. this seems to be a bit lower than usual. It's normally over 200, but I think that's reflective of the slowing down of the asylum process because of the pandemic. And schools where asylum seekers are located tend to be nearer the city centre where the housing is, and our schools with the largest numbers at the moment are Terrace Road, Plasmar, St Joseph's Cathedral Primary and Pentre Havard. And I think it's important to recognise that we've been a dispersal area for asylum seekers for around 20 years now. It's quite a long time. So those schools are well versed in terms of supporting the learners from asylum seeker and refugee backgrounds. We've got a very welcoming ethos in the city and a lot of inclusive and effective practice happening in those schools. It's more difficult with numbers of refugees, particularly linked to those the definitions as well. In the schools management system, there's around about 340, so it's about 1% of the school population recorded as refugees at the moment, but it's difficult to really know how accurate that number is. And we also need to consider that, particularly with refugees, many of those may have been living in the city for a long time and be fully integrated into society. But we're a really, really diverse city, as I'm sure you know, and our schools are very diverse. And amongst all of our minority ethnic and EAL learners, the children speak over 140 plus languages and dialects other than English and Welsh. So it's hugely diverse. And so we need to be mindful that minority ethnic, EAL learners and AS and refugees, they're not homogenous groups at all. And some will have very considerable needs and vulnerabilities, others more settled and integrated, and they'll have different language needs. It's really, really, really important that we think about individuals and schools think about individual learners and what their needs are. But just to add, although I've said there isn't specific support for asylum seekers and refugees, there are two specific schemes that the local authority has been involved in, which you may or may not be familiar. So the Syrian resettlement programme that transpired with the war in Syria, that is now called the UK resettlement scheme, and more recently the Arab scheme, which is linked to Afghanistan. So with the Syrian resettlement programme, the local authority originally committed to 60 families over a 5-year period, and we've now come to that end of that 5-year period. And we've had 11 families in through the Arab scheme. Those schemes are Home Office funded. They're not, the children aren't supported via education. It's through the refugee, migration, refugee and asylum seeker coordinator who sits outside of education. And there are 3 bilingual teaching assistants that actually work with those learners in school. So it's slightly different, but we do work very, very closely together. And I do have some kind of supervision and advisory role over the bilingual teaching assistants where that's needed in terms of guiding their work. So these schemes are very, very different to asylum seekers arriving in the city and so on, because they're very managed and the information about the families is known in advance of them arriving in the city. School places are worked out and allocated in advance of them arriving. So it's very, very different to the general, if you like, migration into the city. And as I said, there is dedicated Home Office funding and there is an element for education. It does, in essence, create a slightly two-tiered system because the Home Office funding is probably more generous than funding elsewhere. So we think more about sort of general support. Obviously, we've just been through and at the tail end of the COVID-19 pandemic, and at the very start of the pandemic, we recognise that asylum seeker families in particular were going to be potentially very, very vulnerable groups when we took into account financial circumstances, reliance on public transport, and language barriers and so on. So although at the time we weren't centrally directly supporting those families, it was deemed that it was a valuable repurposing of the team to try and support those families and make sure they were okay, they were getting free school meals, and so on. So because we had the housing list, we were able to find phone numbers and contact those families. We had a slightly bigger team at the time, so we were in contact with families over 200 asylum seeker children. And we were able to gather information and pass on and resolve any issues that came up, whether that was access to free school meals, general wellbeing issues. And as time went on, then we were involved in ensuring that they had the equipment and Wi-Fi to have digital access to education, so that they could participate in home and blended learning. So it was a very, very key part of our work early on. And also the staff in the central team were involved in free school meal delivery, which actually that doorstep seeing families also helped support families, because we could pick up other issues and resolve them from the doorstep. Eventually the free school meals payments were added to the Aspen card. So the Aspen card is like the asylum seekers bank card. It's where their payments are added onto. So that was working with the Home Office and Kelly Small in the funding team and Helen Clancy, the migration and asylum seeker coordinator, that we were able to negotiate that. And we were the first local authority in Wales that achieved this. And this gave a lot of flexibility to families in terms of their food and free school meals and how they were able to use that money. And we know from feedback through third sector organisations that was very, very much appreciated. We've always endeavoured throughout the pandemic and continuing on to try to ensure that any key education information is translated into some of our main languages. Obviously, with 140 languages across the whole remit, it's not possible to translate everything. And we try to focus on some of the languages that are main languages within the asylum seeker groups. So more recently, we've translated lots of the information leaflets and letters pertinent to the ALN reform. And this is just to help communication and parents access information. I think very, very early on, as the pandemic was surfacing, our local City of Sanctuary group set up a multi-agency meeting for those agencies that support asylum seekers and refugees, and myself, the asylum seeker, refugee and migration coordinator were part of that group, and that was really, really highly successful, and still is highly successful, and has forged very effective long-term partnership working. So we're able to exchange information, share information, and make sure that we work together to support the families and the learners. So third sector agencies have now got more of a key point of contact for queries about individual learners, and we've got very, very strong work in relationships. So I'm able to ensure that those agencies that are working with families on the ground understand the systems, know how to apply for school places, how to apply for the free school meals, how to apply for discretionary transport and so on, and vice versa. We've got more working knowledge of the agencies, so we can signpost schools on, because the well-being of those families is probably quite as key as the learning in school. So that's really successful, and those meetings still continuing on and really work well. So as I mentioned earlier, asylum seekers and refugees are part of the wider group of minority ethnic and EAL learners, and that broader work that we carry out. So our key driver for our work is really an evaluation exercise that we carry out with schools. So that lets us look at the practice and try and further develop practice. So we've developed a tool that asks a range of questions under 8 key areas. So those areas are having a whole school approach, funding, resourcing and professional learning, developing inclusive school cultures, enhanced admissions and settling processes, engagement with parents, EAL assessment and ongoing monitoring, teaching and learning, and EAL and learning difficulties. What we're trying to promote that it's imperative that EAL practice is not an add-on in schools, but it should be very, very intrinsic to the working of schools. And similarly, the cultural inclusivity and valuing of diversity should be integral and not tokenistic. It's not an add-on, it's not tokenistic. It needs to be embedded into those whole school practices. So effective school-based submission processes should gather relevant information to identify needs of learners and their parents. So very, very key for asylum seeker families and new arrivals into the city for schools to gather that information in the first place to make sure that teaching and learning strategies can be put in place, grouping strategies, and that they know the needs of the parents in terms of communications are very, very key. There is specific EAL assessment which identifies English language learning needs of pupils, and those then inform relevant teaching strategies and ensure that children and young people can access the learning in the classroom and the curriculum. So there are some particular questions in the evaluation tool that are pertinent to asylum seekers and refugees, but in general, developing that embedded and effective practice across all of those 8 areas will have a positive impact on these particular groups. So we determine from the evaluation whether the school's provision is embedded and sustained or established, developing or not yet in place. Luckily, we haven't got anyone in the not yet in place. So we carried out a first set of evaluations pre-pandemic, and we were able to go out and revisit or re-meet with schools in the summer term in 2021. So we work with 46 schools now, so they're the schools with our highest numbers. And encouragingly, even though we've at the bar with the evaluation tool, we have 32.6% of schools in developing, whereas previously we had 50%. So despite the pandemic, the practice is improving, and that's really, really encouraging. From the evaluation activity is key in that we can then identify any local authority-wide development needs and examples of good practice for sharing, and we use EAL network meetings to share and develop the EAL coordinators and pass information out and develop practice. We run a CPD programme. In all honesty, it's been fairly low-key over the period of the pandemic, with the recognition that schools had certain, very, very key priorities and the difficulty of releasing staff. So as we're moving, hopefully, into more normal times, we will increase that and run much more comprehensive programme. We've also developed a handbook that guides schools, advises schools, and points to resources, and this aligns with the SharePoint where we store everything, so there's accessible information for schools. One work stream that does have specific relevance to asylum seekers and refugees is the Schools of Sanctuary Award scheme. So this is an accredited scheme, and an accredited School of Sanctuary receives recognition from City of Sanctuary UK in the form of a Sanctuary Award for good practice in fostering a culture of welcome and inclusion. And schools have to demonstrate under 3 principles. So the first principle is learn, and they need to help their students, staff and community learn about what it means to be seeking sanctuary and issues around forced migration. Of course, very topical at the moment. They need to embed, so they need to commit to creating a safe and inclusive culture of welcome that benefits everybody, and they need to share that work. So it's a really, really excellent scheme. It does align with the types of practice that we do advocate through the evaluation tool and the action planning that we do with schools. So Pentrahava was a previously awarded Schools of Sanctuary status quite a number of years ago, so they're going for reassessment. St Joseph's Cathedral Primary gained the award pre-pandemic, and we've been working in partnership with the local City of Sanctuary volunteers and their group to support more schools to gain the award. So we've got 5 schools who are about to apply for the award in the summer term. We have quite a number of schools that are either already on their journey or are very interested in the award. So I can see that this is a scheme that is going to expand. And obviously the 5 schools that are going for the award this year, we're going to collect all the work that they did. There's some really excellent practice, fantastic examples of welcoming ethos and so on. So we'll collect all that and share those with other schools. So that's really, really specific to asylum seekers and refugees, although it doesn't only apply to schools that have those populations. So one of the schools going for the award this year is actually Ysgol Gyfun Goer, who have very low diversity, low EAL numbers, and don't have asylum seekers or refugees. So that would be a really good example going forward, that actually any school in Swansea could go for this award. So as well as building on the collaborations in the schools of sanctuary work and the work that we're doing with schools, I think the pandemic itself has focused a lot on inequalities that have come up through it. So there is quite a big shift at the moment and significant momentum to improve inclusivity and equity for minority ethnic groups. And that is coupled with the current curriculum and the curriculum for Wales that's going to come into being in September, which has some really interesting elements that we can work with to try and progress what we've always advocated, really. So things around, we've got diversity as a cross-cutting theme. There's aspects that build on learners' home languages. There's the focus on the diverse experiences and contributions of Black, Asian and minority ethnic people. So there's some really, really exciting work going on in the background now, and I really think there's significant momentum, as I said, to really work and improve our inclusivity. And obviously, also recently, Education SLB have agreed to a slight increase in the number of posts within my team, which will give us more capacity. And within that, I do want to ensure that there is a bit more of a specific responsibility for some of the more vulnerable groups within the minority ethnic learners, so asylum seekers and refugees, and to really, really have a key focus on that Schools of Sanctuary Award and be able to really support schools to gain that award and to share all the work. And obviously going forward, it's highly likely that there's going to be a pressing need to support Ukrainian refugee children and young people likely to arrive in our city. But I think we have a really, really good basis to work from within the schools, within the local authority, and with our engagement and collaborations with third sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really thorough report, and obviously challenging when you're looking at 140 languages across Swansea. You wouldn't realise that, would you? Really? Could I ask, and then open it up to questions? Has any provision been made for any children from Ukraine? Because clearly that is going to happen shortly. And obviously that is something that people will be concerned about in Swansea, to make sure they are obviously properly looked after. Robert.
Yes, so I think, sorry.
No, I don't know if Robert wants to come in first, or
Yeah, you carry on, Pam. You say something at the end. Sorry.
I think it's sort of next on my agenda, really, to look at what we've got already and what can we prepare in advance of any learners coming in. I think what I was thinking about earlier today was, we've obviously with the scheme, I'm not sure how we're going to be able to know how many children may arrive in the city, so it's slightly unknown. It's different to the Syrian resettlement programme and the children and the families that came in from Afghanistan, because they're very, very managed and the local authority knows in advance. And I think I also need to consider that there is the potential that the children may be in schools that don't traditionally have asylum seekers and refugees in Swansea. So if we're thinking about the community and individuals that may sponsor individuals, we don't know where that will be. So I think I need to just think in advance, really. We put training on schools, we look at information that we've got translated and make sure it's into Ukrainian. So there's lots we can do. As more information comes forward, we'll be able to prepare. So I don't have any concerns about it, but I think it's going to be challenging in terms of the unpredictability of it, I think.
Yeah.
but we can preempt some of that. And obviously I work very closely with Helen Clancy, the Migration, Refugee and Asylum Seeker Coordinator. So I'll be liaising with her, and she's the key point in the local authority who will have the information about how the schemes are going to work. And we have very, very close working connections with the third sector agencies that might go down the community sponsorship route. So it's quite early days at the moment in terms of the scheme, but it's forefront of my mind.
Great, thank you, because I think with
So communities are able to support the other schools.
Okay, great, thank you. Robert, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Pam for giving us such a comprehensive overview, because I think, what we have in Swansea is a well-established service